With a population of more than 200 million people, with rainforests so vast they generate their own weather, and with evidence of human life dating back over 30,000 years, Brazil is not just a country, it is a contradiction. Look at a map of South America. Nearly every nation on the continent speaks Spanish. Nearly every border traces the legacy of Spanish conquest. And yet, in the largest country on the continent, the language is Portuguese, not Spanish, Portuguese. How did this happen? How did Portugal, a relatively small European kingdom clinging to the edge of the Atlantic, manage to claim, hold, and ultimately shape half of South America? And more importantly, how did Brazil survive European colonization without being erased, fragmented, or permanently broken like so many other lands? To understand the answer, we must go back to a moment that may not have been an accident at all. The year is 1500. A fleet of Portuguese ships cuts across the Atlantic, their sails swollen with wind, their destination supposedly set for India. At their head sails Pedro Álvares Cabral, a nobleman entrusted with expanding Portugal's growing overseas empire. Officially, Cabral is blown wildly off course. Officially, land appears on the horizon by chance. But history is rarely that simple. Some historians point to earlier accounts, including writings by Duarte Pacheco Pereira, suggesting that Portuguese navigators may have known about this land years earlier, possibly as early as 1498. If that is true, then Brazil was not discovered by accident. It was claimed deliberately. Cabral's fleet makes landfall at what is now Porto Seguro, stepping onto a coastline unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Towering forests, endless beaches, a climate heavy with life. But they are not alone. Thousands of indigenous people watch from the tree line, societies with their own languages, belief systems, and histories stretching back millennia. At first, contact is cautious, even cooperative. The Portuguese quickly notice something valuable, pau-brasil, a redwood prized in Europe for producing vibrant dye. It becomes Brazil's first export, and the first reason Europeans decide this land is worth keeping. Trade begins. Axes and metal tools for timber and labor, an uneasy balance. But this balance does not last. As the redwood forests are stripped bare along the coast, the Portuguese push inland, driven by greed and competition. Forests fall, villages vanish, and cooperation gives way to coercion. The land is no longer a curiosity, it is a resource. And resources in the European colonial mindset must be extracted, controlled, and exploited. By the early 1500s, Portugal faces a dilemma. Brazil is vast, far larger than Portugal itself. Its indigenous population is numerous but resistant, and its potential wealth is too great to abandon. So Portugal makes a choice that will shape Brazil forever. They divide the land. In the 1530s, Brazil is split into massive hereditary captaincies, enormous strips of territory handed to wealthy Portuguese nobles. On paper, it looks efficient. In reality, it's chaos. Most of these colonies fail. Disease spreads, indigenous resistance intensifies, settlements collapse under their own weight. Only one thing becomes clear. Brazil cannot be ruled like other colonies. It is too large, too wild, too defiant. And yet Portugal refuses to let it go. Because somewhere beneath the jungles, the rivers, and the blood-soaked soil, Brazil is becoming something unusual. Not just a colony, but a foundation for survival. And soon, other European powers will notice. Portugal may have been the first to plant its flag on Brazil's shores, but it would not be the last to set its sights on the land.
Because once word spread across Europe about Brazil's vast forests, fertile soil, and strategic Atlantic coastline, other powers began asking an uncomfortable question. Why should Portugal have all of this? The Treaty of Tordesillas, a line drawn on a map by Iberian monarchs and blessed by the Pope, claimed Brazil for Portugal. But outside of Lisbon, Madrid, and the Vatican, that line meant very little. France ignored it. England dismissed it, the Netherlands openly challenged it. and Brazil became a prize. The first serious challenge came from the French. In the mid-16th century, French ships began appearing along Brazil's coast, trading directly with indigenous groups and undercutting Portuguese control. Unlike Portugal, the French did not attempt immediate domination. They integrated, allied, and adapted. In 1555, they made their boldest move. A French colony was established in what is now Rio de Janeiro, known as France Antarctique. For a moment, it seemed Portugal might lose its greatest possession. The French built forts, they secured indigenous alliances, and they openly defied Portuguese authority. But Portugal responded with force. By 1567, after brutal fighting and calculated diplomacy, the Portuguese expelled the French and founded the city of Rio de Janeiro itself, not just as a settlement, but as a statement. Brazil would not be shared. The lesson was clear. Portugal could not rely on treaties alone. Brazil had to be defended, occupied, and governed, or it would be taken. This realization triggered a shift. The crown reclaimed failed captaincies, a governor-general was appointed, and Salvador was established as Brazil's first capital in 1549. For the first time, Brazil was no longer an experiment, it was a priority. But the threats did not end. In the 17th century, a new rival emerged, one far more organized and far more dangerous: the Dutch. At the height of their global trading empire, the Dutch seized large portions of northeastern Brazil, including Recife, transforming the region into a profitable sugar powerhouse under Dutch rule. For over 2 decades, Portugal lost control of some of Brazil's richest lands. Yet, once again, Portugal refused to surrender. Through prolonged warfare, shifting alliances, and relentless pressure, the Portuguese eventually drove the Dutch out by 1654. What made this remarkable was not just Portugal's victory, but Brazil's role in it. Local militias, mixed-race fighters, former slaves, and indigenous warriors. Brazil was no longer just being defended by Portugal, it was defending itself. And this marks a crucial turning point in Brazil's survival. Unlike many colonies, Brazil was not fractured into competing European holdings. Spain never split it, France never carved it up, the Dutch never permanently claimed it. Brazil remained whole. But unity came at a devastating cost. As sugar plantations expanded and profits soared, the indigenous population collapsed. Disease ravaged communities, enslavement intensified, entire cultures vanished. Portugal needed labor, and Brazil's original inhabitants were disappearing. So Portugal turned east, across the Atlantic, to Africa. What followed would permanently reshape Brazil's society, culture, and identity, while laying the groundwork for both its wealth and its suffering. Because survival in Brazil's case did not mean innocence, it meant endurance through brutality, and the next chapter would define Brazil more than any war with Europe ever could. By the early 1600s, Brazil had become something Europe understood very well: a machine designed to turn land into profit and human beings into fuel. The sugar plantations of Brazil were among the most lucrative enterprises in the Atlantic world. Vast fields of cane stretched across the northeast, feeding mills that never slept, exporting sweetness to Europe at an enormous human cost. But there was a problem. The indigenous population was collapsing. Disease, forced labor, and displacement had wiped out entire communities. Those who survived often fled deep into the interior, beyond the reach of Portuguese control. The colony was expanding, but its workforce was vanishing. Portugal's solution was neither new nor moral, but it was devastatingly effective. They turned to Africa. Portugal had already established trading networks along the African coast. They had already begun enslaving Africans and transporting them across the Atlantic. But now Brazil became the primary destination, and the scale was staggering.
Roughly 40% of all Africans taken in the transatlantic slave trade were sent to Brazil, more than 8 times the number that arrived in what would become the United States. Men, women, and children were torn from their homelands, crammed into ships, and sold as property in a land they had never seen, to labor until death in fields, mines, and cities. Brazil did not merely participate in the slave trade, it was built on it. And yet, even in this system of extreme brutality, something unexpected happened. Brazil did not become culturally uniform. Instead, African traditions fused with Portuguese customs and indigenous influences, creating new religions, music, foods, and identities. From candomblé to capoeira, from rhythms to language itself, Brazil became something unique, forged through suffering but resistant to erasure. Still, resistance was constant. Enslaved people escaped into the interior, forming quilombos, autonomous communities hidden in forests and mountains. The most famous of these, Palmares, survived for nearly a century, defying Portuguese authority and standing as a living symbol of freedom. Portugal eventually destroyed Palmares, but it could not destroy the idea behind it. Meanwhile, Brazil's wealth continued to grow. Gold and diamonds were discovered inland, new cities rose, trade expanded, and the capital eventually shifted from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro, reflecting Brazil's growing importance within the Portuguese Empire. By the 18th century, Brazil was no longer a distant colony, it was the empire's economic heart. And then Europe exploded. In the early 19th century, Napoleon's armies swept across the continent, shattering kingdoms and collapsing centuries-old orders. Portugal was next. Facing invasion, the unthinkable happened. The Portuguese royal family did not flee to another European capital, they fled to Brazil. For the first time in history, a European empire would be ruled from its own colony. Ships carrying the crown, the court, and the bureaucracy crossed the Atlantic in desperation, and, in doing so, transformed Brazil forever. Suddenly, Brazil was no longer governed from afar, it became the center of power. Ports opened, banks were founded, universities were established. Brazil was no longer just surviving colonization, it was outgrowing it. And when the Portuguese king finally returned to Europe, he left something behind that would make independence not only possible, but inevitable. A prince and a choice. In most of the Americas, independence came through fire, revolution, fragmentation, endless civil wars. But Brazil's break from Europe followed a different path, a quieter path, a more dangerous one. When Napoleon was finally defeated and stability returned to Europe, King João VI faced a dilemma. Portugal demanded his return. Brazil, now thriving as the center of the empire, did not want to go back to being a colony. In 1815, Brazil was elevated to the status of a kingdom equal to Portugal itself, no longer merely an overseas possession. It was an unprecedented move, but it did not last. When Dom João VI returned to Lisbon in 1821, he left his son behind in Brazil, Prince Pedro, as regent, and the Portuguese government made its intentions clear. Brazil was to be reduced again. Taxes would rise, institutions would be dismantled, authority would return to Europe. Prince Pedro was ordered to come home. He refused. On September 7, 1822, standing near the banks of the Ipiranga River, Pedro made his choice: independence or death. With those words, Brazil declared itself free. But here is what makes Brazil's survival extraordinary. There was no immediate collapse, no fragmentation into rival states, no continental war of independence lasting decades. Instead, Brazil became an empire, with Pedro I crowned as Emperor Pedro I. This continuity mattered. The same borders remained, the same institutions functioned, the same elites retained stability. When Portugal attempted to reclaim control, Brazil fought back, by land and sea, and by the end of 1823, the last Portuguese garrison surrendered. Brazil had won. But survival demanded sacrifice. Pedro I proved unable to navigate Brazil's internal tensions. Political instability, regional revolts, and mounting pressure forced him to abdicate the throne in 1831, leaving it to his 5-year-old son, Pedro II.
For nearly a decade, Brazil was ruled by regents, and the empire nearly collapsed. Rebellions erupted across the country, provinces threatened secession, the fragile unity Portugal had unintentionally preserved now hung by a thread. But, against expectations, Brazil held together. In 1840, Pedro II was declared of age early and took the throne. Under his long reign, Brazil stabilized. Trade expanded, immigration increased, the nation modernized. And yet, one great contradiction remained.
Slavery. Brazil would be the last country in the Americas to abolish it, not until 1888. A year later, the monarchy fell. In 1889, Brazil became a republic. Once again, the nation transformed without tearing itself apart. But peace was never permanent. The 20th century brought dictatorships, military rule, economic collapse, and political turmoil. Inflation soared, democracy faltered, power shifted hands through coups rather than votes. And yet, Brazil endured. Through every transformation, one truth remained. Brazil survived not because it avoided hardship, but because it adapted to it. Its size made conquest difficult. Its unity prevented fragmentation. Its culture absorbed pain and turned it into identity. Which raises the final question: was Brazil's survival an accident of history, or the result of forces far larger than any empire? Brazil should not exist in the form we know today. By every historical pattern, it should have shattered. It should have splintered into rival states like Spanish America. It should have been carved up by foreign empires. It should have collapsed under the weight of slavery, rebellion, dictatorship, and economic chaos. And yet, it didn't. To understand why Brazil survived European colonization, we must abandon the idea that survival means purity, justice, or moral victory. Brazil survived because it was useful. Useful to Portugal as an economic engine, useful to European markets as a supplier of sugar, gold, coffee, and rubber, useful to global trade as an Atlantic gateway between continents. Portugal did not rule Brazil loosely, it ruled it continuously. Where Spain governed through fragmentation, Portugal governed through concentration. Brazil remained administratively whole, not because Portugal was benevolent, but because dividing it would have weakened control. Ironically, this exploitation preserved unity. When independence came, Brazil inherited intact borders, something few former colonies could claim. There was no scramble to redraw the map, no regional generals carving out kingdoms, no competing capitals declaring supremacy. Brazil began its independent life already whole. Its second advantage was cultural absorption. Brazil did not erase identities, it layered them. Indigenous knowledge blended with African resilience and Portuguese structures. Language unified the nation. Religion adapted rather than fractured. Music, food, and social life became shared rather than segregated. Even slavery, one of Brazil's greatest moral scars, did not produce rigid racial caste lines identical to those elsewhere. While inequality endured, identity in Brazil became fluid enough to prevent permanent societal fracture. Then there was geography. Brazil is vast beyond comprehension. Invading it is difficult. Controlling it is exhausting. Fragmenting it is nearly impossible. Forests, rivers, mountains, and distance protected Brazil from total domination, both from Europe and from itself. And finally, timing mattered. When Europe descended into chaos under Napoleon, Brazil was elevated rather than abandoned. Hosting the Portuguese crown transformed it from colony to center, creating institutions that no rebellion needed to destroy. Brazil did not overthrow its rulers, it outgrew them. But survival does not mean victory. Brazil's history is marked by suffering, indigenous annihilation, centuries of slavery, authoritarian rule, and persistent inequality. Independence did not erase these wounds. It merely allowed Brazil to carry them forward on its own terms. Today, Brazil stands as a paradox, a nation born of exploitation, shaped by resistance,
held together by adaptation. It is the only major nation in the Americas born from the Portuguese side of the Treaty of Tordesillas, a line drawn on a map that was never meant to last. And yet, Brazil did. Not because colonization was kind, but because Brazil learned how to survive it. And that raises a final question, one history rarely asks. If Brazil survived European colonization, what might it become when it finally confronts its past honestly? That conversation is still unfolding. And now it's your turn. What do you think truly allowed Brazil to endure where others fractured? Was it unity, geography, culture, or pure historical accident? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden forces of history, subscribe for more cinematic documentaries like this, and stay curious.